Hello, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 15, Christianity and the Formation of Europe. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the rise of Christianity. Christianity spread quickly as the Roman Empire diminished. At the beginning of Christianity, they were persecuted. The Romans were still in charge, and they had their polytheistic religion. And they really looked at Christianity as a kind of cult, and so they persecuted the Christians. And so what we're going to see is that in the early time period of Christianity, they're going to worship and hide in catacombs and smaller buildings. In the artwork, there's going to be more emphasis on storytelling as a way of conveying what was in the Bible. So the first style that we're going to talk about is early Christian. This is Christ as the Son from the mid-3rd century. This was a portion of a mosaic found in a burial chamber known as a necropolis, which is kind of like an underground burial system. In it, we see a mixture of imagery between kind of classical Roman imagery and then this new Christian imagery. If you look at the way Christ is represented, you can see that he's in kind of traditional Roman garb, but then he's got a halo, and the halo kind of has this cross formation that's going to be a Christian symbol. You also see Roman chariot in the background here, and their horses that are drawing that chariot. And then you also have the grapevine leaves that represented in Roman mythology and Greek mythology, the Greek god Dionysus, who was the Greek god of fertility and wine. But the symbol was appropriated by Christians as a way of kind of showing the communion and the use of wine to represent the blood of Christ. So in these really early Christian images, we're going to see these symbols become appropriated by the Christians as, you know, the quote-unquote pagan artists were trained in these symbols. They just use them in a new way. In 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued an edict for tolerance of Christianity and really became the first Christian Roman emperor. So after this time, we're going to see that Christianity becomes much more accepted, and therefore many more people are going to be worshiping in Christianity, so you need larger buildings. And Old St. Peter's is one of the earliest cathedrals that we have record of. We don't have it anymore. It's not around anymore. But this is a reconstruction of it. And we're looking at Old St. Peter's from 320. On the left, you can see kind of a cutaway plan, what it would look like, and then a reconstruction drawing. On the right, you can see we have a plan for a Roman basilica, and then the plan for Old St. Peter's. So Old St. Peter's was based on the idea of a Roman basilica, which was just like a multi-purpose meeting hall that could have been used for community gatherings. And you can see that it's the same in the sense that you have this long, narrow building called a longitudinal plan, where you have it's based on that kind of long and narrow structure. However, the difference is that we have the addition of a transept right here, and you can see the transept kind of forms like almost a cross look to the plan of the building, and that cross was important as a symbol of Christianity, and we're going to see that continue throughout Christian art. So this is a sculpture of Constantine the Great from 325 to 326. This was commissioned by the Emperor Constantine when he moved the capital to Constantinople, which later became Byzantium. In it, you can see that we have a new style that's developing. You know, when we look back at Roman art, you think of naturalism, you think of portraitures being very accurate, whereas in this portrait we see exaggerated features, especially the eyes. So we're moving away from the idealized naturalism of Greece and the realism found in Rome. So instead of trying to show what the exact exterior of a person looked like. What they're trying to show is more kind of a spiritual feeling. And so that's why we have these large kind of open eyes, kind of like the eyes are the window to the soul, kind of representing him in a more spiritual way, trying to represent his spirit rather than what he physically looked like. And we're going to see that continue on when we get into later styles. So in early Christian art, you're going to see a mixture or hybrid of Christian and classical imagery. Two-dimensional work is going to become more abstract to increase the spirituality of it. The architecture we're going to see is based on the Roman basilica, so it's longitudinal, and then we have the addition of the transept. When we see Christ, he's going to be shown as a youthful shepherd, sometimes a teacher. He'll be beardless, and again, shepherd or teacher. So the next style we're going to look at is Byzantine style. And in Byzantine art, we're talking about an area known as Byzantium in the East. And they made Christianity the official religion of the state. And the art is going to reflect the riches of the Roman Empire and images of Christ. This is San Vitale from 527. This is a great example of Byzantine architecture in that it has a central plan. So if you look at the footprint of the building, which we can see right here, you see that it's what I mean when I say a centralized plan is that it rotates around kind of a central axis in the middle. And you can see from the exterior that central part of the building is this dome that's here encased in an octagonal structure. The building itself is an octagon, which is something that you're going to see commonly, more commonly in Byzantine architecture. The exterior of Byzantine churches and cathedrals are going to be very plain. So here you can just see that it just has kind of simple brickwork with some arched windows. While the interior is where you're going to see most of the decoration. So it's quite a bit different from what we saw in Roman architecture or Greek architecture, where the exterior was considered to be very important. And the interior would have been used for statues, etc. Whereas here, the exteriors are very plain, and the interiors are going to be fully decorated with mosaic works. This is an example of that. This is Empress Theodora and retinue from 547. So this was decorated, this is part of what would have been decorating San Vitale. And San Vitale was built under the patroness of the Empress. So we see a blend of religion and politics here. So if you can imagine walking into a religious building today in America and seeing an image of the president, for example, hanging on the wall, that would be somewhat unusual because we do have a separation of church and state. In Byzantium, there was no such separation. So seeing an image of the Empress in a cathedral would not be uncommon. Even though she never necessarily set foot in the cathedral, her representation was there to kind of convey her presence. So in terms of the style that we're seeing here, you'll notice that the figures have become very two-dimensional. You can see how one figure here is kind of stepping on the foot of another. It's not necessarily that he's stepping on the foot, but maybe just kind of like they're stacked in space. The figures themselves, like I said, are very flat. You don't see a lot of shading. The drapery is going to be very stylized with, you can see here how it almost looks like it's been ironed into these flat folds. The background itself is showing, it's supposed to be showing the interior of San Vitale, so we're seeing kind of an image of the image itself. That makes sense. She is holding the chalice, getting ready to take part in the ceremony of communion. So again, showing her as being very essential part of the church. So this kind of flat decorative richness is typical of Byzantine architecture, and it was developed as a way to inspire the illiterate while keeping the biblical commandment that forbids graven imagery. So this idea that when we see human figures in churches that we might have false idolatry going on, where we're going to see people actually start to worship the image, is done away with by the abstraction of the figures, because these figures are so abstract, they're not necessarily going to be seen as real human figures. Hopefully that makes sense. Here is another interior of a cathedral. This is Christ as Pantocrator from Sicily in 1183. When we see Christ as Pantocrator, Pantocrator is the standard image in Byzantine iconography that means ruler of all. So he's seen as this majestic ruler rather than a youthful shepherd or teacher here. The image that we're seeing of Christ here is emphasizing the divine, awe-inspiring version of Christ versus the more approachable form that we saw in early Christianity. So Christ is at the top, and you can see that he's the largest, so we still have that hierarchical scale. Directly below him, we have Mary and another version of Christ here as a child in her lap. She's surrounded by angels, and then we have saints surrounding Christ up above. So we have this real hierarchy of scale going on, and who's most important? Well, Christ is most important, but then Mary is second most important. And you can see she's seated in a throne, but she's still taller than the surrounding saints and angels. You'll notice that the background is completely gold rather than having a setting like we saw in the last mosaic. Here we have that move away from naturalism, where the figures are flattened and abstract, but also the background is kind of non-existent. It's just that gold. When we see gold, it represents heavenly splendor. Notice how the figures are also very motionless, and they just kind of stare forward, really emphasizing that abstractness of the figures. If you look at the drapery again, you'll notice how it's very linear, very much like it's been ironed into place, like it's flattened out. And that, again, that abstraction is there to emphasize the spirituality and to move away from this idea of false idolatry. This is Icon with Crucifixion from 1100. We would see icons very commonly during the Byzantine time period. An icon is just a picture of a sacred object that was meant to inspire devotion, but not to be worshipped in and of themselves. So, you know, when we think about Roman or Greek art in particular, we see them actually worshiping the statues. And Christianity was very much against that idea of a statue or an image representing the actual, you know, person coming down and inhabiting it. And so they want to see more abstraction as a way to separate the image of the figure from reality. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're going to see more abstraction, and in this one we can see that the figures are kind of elongated, which means kind of stretched out. This is an image of Christ called the Sleeping Christ, where he's on the cross and he's kind of dead but still alive at the same time. He doesn't seem to be in a lot of pain according to his facial expression. You can see his wounds here are bleeding, but he has this very relaxed kind of posture that's meant to convey a sense of kind of invitation, like not wanting to disgust the viewer by showing too much kind of gruesome detail. Below Christ, we have Mary here kind of pointing at him, and then we have Joseph on the other side. And you'll notice how they form this implied triangle with Christ at the top. So it's a hierarchical structure, and as opposed to a scale here. Again, we have that gold background and the saints surrounding. This is another icon called Madonna and Child on Curved Throne from the 13th century. So here we have a composition that's based on circular shapes and linear patterns. The drapery there is very stylized and almost like sunburst lines coming out from parts of it that really kind of hide the body underneath and tend to flatten out the body. She's sitting on what appears to be a throne with this light gold background again. So in review of the Byzantine style, Two-dimensional work is going to become more abstract to increase spirituality. That's going to be seen in both mosaics and illuminated manuscripts. We're going to see a flattening of figures and a stylization of drapery, as well as a loss of background imagery. So the gold background is going to be seen as a symbol of the splendors of heaven. Plain exterior is going to continue in architecture, but we're going to see some Roman influence in columns, arches, and domes. The interiors are rich with mosaic decoration. When we see Christ, he's shown as a mature adult. You'll see him bearded and shown in imperial purple robes to show his royal status. He's also going to be shown as the Pantocrator, the ruler of all, and the last judge. So that's going to bring us into the Middle Ages. The Roman emperor was too vast to control and fell in 476. So in the more western areas in Europe, we're going to see a time period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance called the Middle Ages. We're first going to talk about the early Middle Ages. And this is an example of a purse cover from 625. This was found at a burial site of an unknown Anglican king. It's made of gold and enamel. And it's what is called animal style, where we have interlacing animals, interlacing design. Here you can see the animals that are entwined with one another, as well as this more intricate design work. Sometimes you'll see plant forms or just linear works that are intertwined in animal style. So we're going to see more small portable objects during this time period, as opposed to larger structures and sculptures and artworks. An important artistic product that we're going to see during this time period is going to be Christian scripture. And in some of these early ones, we're actually going to see a merging of like early Christian style with animal style. The books were copied by monks and what we call illuminated by monks. An illumination is when you're furnishing a book with illustrations and decorations. So when I say illuminated manuscript, it just means a manuscript that has illustrations in it. This is an example of a page from a Bible. It's called Lion from 675. You can see the animal style around the edges here, as well as within the animal itself with the patterning and this kind of intricate outline, and then the interlaced designs around the lion. The lion is actually a symbol of Saint Mark, and it was shown at the beginning of the book of Mark. But we've seen the lion before, right? We've seen it in Mycenaean art, for example. We've seen it in Egyptian art as a symbol of power. So this idea of the lion is kind of transcribed into Christian philosophy at this point. This is the Cairo monogram from the late 8th century. In it, we see a complicated, complex design of kind of interlacing design. You can see it, and it's just kind of pattern upon pattern within here. You can see the large X here, which is also a P, which is a symbol of Christianity. There are going to be figures kind of hidden within there. That it's really meant to be this very complex, almost maze-like quality to it. It was a way of kind of trapping the devil in the maze and keeping the devil out. So a style of art that happened after the Emperor Charlemagne had his rule is called Carolingian. And during this time, we're going to see Charlemagne take an active interest in artistic matters and really start to follow more of the Roman architecture style. So this particular structure was modeled after San Vitale, which was considered to be a Roman building, even though it was in Byzantium. It's going to be heavier and thicker than Byzantine architecture. You're also going to see, instead of mosaics decorating the inside, you have these patterned voussoirs, which are these stones that the arch is made of. And then you have columns and arches up above. But it's a less complex interior than we would have seen in the Byzantine style. And this building actually signaled the end of the early Middle Ages, and is going to bring in the High Middle Ages. But before we get to that, let's do the early medieval review. So when we're talking about early medieval style, we're seeing an interlacing animal style, carpet page illuminated manuscript, where you see that rich pattern and design. Signs and symbols are going to be used to represent divine figures like the lion. You're going to see heavy, massive architecture. So that's going to bring in the High Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages is divided into two periods known as the Romanesque and then the Gothic. The Romanesque is from 1050 to 1200 and was based on more of a Southern Roman style, whereas the Gothic is going to be more of a Northern style. There's an intensely religious preoccupation during this time, and we're going to see many great cathedrals being built. It's really kind of considered a building boom during this time period, as we're seeing more Christians want to take what we call pilgrimages or journeys in order to see all of these different relics, which are important Christian objects that would have been stored in these cathedrals. The Roman architecture is going to be characterized by massive, thick walls, round arches, and barrel vaults. So very, very similar to Roman architecture, which is why it's called Romanesque. So this is Sainte-Foy from France, 1050 to 1120, one of the earliest Romanesque cathedrals that still stands. You can see here, we're looking at an aerial view of it, and you can see that the building has a cross plan, which is something that continued from early Christian architecture but became more prominent during the Romanesque time period. We do have round arches, you can see here in the windows as well as on the facade of the building. And it housed the reliquary statue of Sainte-Foy, and people would come from long distances in order to see these relics. We're going to look at the statue just in a moment. But you'll notice that the building is longitudinal. It's based on this long, kind of narrow plan. It has two towers on the western facade. So this is where people would enter the building down here. And we're going to see these two towers become very important in Gothic architecture as well. So this is the reliquary statue of Sainte-Foy that would have been inside Sainte-Foy Cathedral. And it held relics, which again are important Christian objects of some sort. It could be a piece of clothing that a saint wore, or even a bone of a body of one of the saints, or an important religious figure. This is made out of gold over wood and is heavily bejeweled. You'll notice in terms of the style, how we have continued with the abstraction that we saw during the early Christian time period, going into the early Middle Ages as well, where the statue here is very stiff, facing straight ahead. The body is hidden beneath the clothing. We don't really get a sense of what the body looks like. And there's a lot of patterning with the jewels and then some of the gold work here, for example. Just to give you an idea of how much detail is on the crown, for example, we have a close-up here. And then I also wanted to show you how it's still in the cathedral and the size of it. You can see here it's holding some roses, so at different times of the year they'll put different objects on the reliquary statue. Stone carvings became very integral in architecture during this time period. This is detail of Christ of the Pentecost from 1125 to 1150. It's at the height of a tympanum, which is it's a carving that would have been over the doorway. And we're seeing the first large sculpture since Roman times in the architectural sculpture from the Romanesque style. You'll notice that Christ is larger in scale, so we see that hierarchical scale here. We have a monumental quality of Christ that's created by making his head somewhat smaller in proportion to the rest of his body, so his body is really emphasized and exaggerated. And then that drapery is continuing the influence of animal style with that kind of patterning that we see and the flattening out of the body underneath. This is the Bayeux Tapestry from 1073 to 88. This is an embroidery, which means that colored yarns are sewn into a woven background. It's a really decorative motif and part of a long picture book. So we're just seeing a detail of a tapestry that is 230 feet long, which is just massive when you think of that. And it's telling the story of the conquest of England by William of Normandy that happened in 1066. So there's a lot of action going on here, but the figures are very flat. Like you'll notice here, even this figure that's falling, it looks like he's kind of cut in half and pasted on the horse as opposed to like actually sitting on the horse. So the sense of overlapping and depth has really been stripped away. Even though this is not a religious artwork, we still see those kind of abstracted figures and animals, like you can see the animal style being represented up here. So Romanesque identifying characteristics include thick, massive walls, small windows. Because you have the thick, massive walls, you can't have large windows or else the walls would fall because they didn't have enough support. You're going to see rounded arches and barrel vaults. Rounded groin vault. So the groin vault is going to happen when you have the transept and the asp crossing each other. Something I didn't mention is that you're going to see repeated geometric units, both horizontally and vertically, on the interior and exterior of the building. So the building could be divided into like little squares and then repeated over and over again, both horizontally and vertically. 2 towers on the western facade. And then within two-dimensional art or sculpture, you're going to see abstracted, stylized figures. So that's going to lead us into the Gothic style, which happens between 1200 and the 15th century in some places. And really the Gothic style continues into the Renaissance in some areas. The term Gothic was applied to this style. It was actually a term that was applied in the Renaissance because they considered the style from this time period to be kind of barbaric. But that term Gothic is very deceptive and really almost opposite to what we really see in Gothic cathedrals. The Gothic style developed when an abbot named Abbot Suger wanted to remodel his abbey, the Saint Denis Abbey. And he wanted to make a more kind of proportional, ideal church that would appear to reach up to heaven. It would be harmonious and it would be filled with light. And for him, the kind of ideal church resulted in pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses, and large stained glass windows. This is Chartres Cathedral from 1260. This is a very interesting building because it's kind of half Romanesque and half Gothic. It was started during the Romanesque time period, but part of it burnt down and had to be rebuilt. And by the time it was rebuilt, the Gothic style had taken hold. So when we look at the western facade, for example, in this picture, you can see that we've got 2 very different towers. One is done in the Romanesque style where we have rounded arches. It's much more simplistic on the exterior. And then on the other side, we have the Gothic where we have more pointed arches. And then you have all of this trace work and filigree work up above. And you'll also notice how it is taller than the Romanesque tower. So this idea of becoming more complex on the exterior as well as reaching higher is something that you're going to see in Gothic architecture. You can see by looking at the plan or the overhead shot of the building, you can see what the plan would look like. Where the cross, it actually looks more like a Christian cross here, where the transept has been moved more towards the middle of the apse. You can see buttressing on the exterior of the building. The buttressing allows for larger windows, which you can see here, for example. You're going to have those windows all throughout the cathedral, and is really meant to let in light and make it a very light and colorful interior, so that when you enter, you're kind of going into this otherworldly feeling of, you know, just colored lights and this beautiful interior space. So here's the plan where you can see the transept has been moved more towards the middle, and you can see these little dots. These represent the columns that are within the interior of the structure, and you'll notice how they form little rectangles and squares, and these are called bays and are used as a measurement throughout the entire building. So the architects were trying to be conscientious of the aesthetic of the building itself, and repeating these units made it feel more geometric, more unified, if you will. So the exterior of the building would have been decorated with sculpture. This is the door jamb statues that were made more in the Romanesque style. And then we have some that were made during the 13th century that are done more in the Gothic style. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about the Romanesque style real quick. So in these figures, we're seeing saints, and you'll notice how they're represented. They're very elongated. The bodies are very narrow and long. They're very flattened and attached to the background. The feet are on pedestals, but you can see how they're kind of pointed, and it almost feels like they're floating figures. The drapery is very stylized and again has that almost ironed flat feeling. The faces of the figures have this kind of archaic smile on them, where it's meant to make them look kind of more lifelike, but has kind of the opposite effect, makes them feel almost frozen and too much like one another. And then we look at the later sculptures, and this is moving more towards the Gothic style, which has more influence from Roman and Greek art. And in it, we're seeing figures that are not attached to the background anymore, not flattened out to the background anyway. They still have halos, but the halos are kind of further behind their heads and show more depth. We have the introduction of contrapposto here, where we have one arm bent, one leg bent, one leg straight, and one arm straight. The drapery is more naturalistic and does not fall in those concentric, rings, for example, that we see here. His head is turned, so he's the most advanced figure here on the end, Saint Theodore right here. The other figures are more standing straight up and down, but they still have that three-dimensionality that these figures are lacking on the left. You'll also notice how they're standing on when they're standing on their platforms, their feet are flat and really appear to be standing rather than floating. So we're having this move towards more realism in the Gothic time period. This is a rose window from Chartres Cathedral. It's one of 3 of these windows at Chartres. This one's dedicated to Mary, who is the centerpiece. She's surrounded by doves, angels, biblical kings, and prophets. The gem-like colors here are meant to represent heavenly splendor, and so in a lot of these stained glass windows, you're going to see like deep reds, deep blues, yellows that kind of mimic gold, those kinds of gem-like colors. In the manuscripts, we're going to see images like this. This is Louis IX and Queen Blanche of Castile from 1226. And then, so you're seeing the queen and the king up above, and then you see monks down below, and the monks are actually making the illuminated manuscripts. In terms of the style, we are starting to see more of a background than we had during the early Middle Ages. So we see a cityscape here. We still have that gold color, but we do have a representation of perspective, although it is not a very convincing perspective. It's more of an orthogonal perspective rather than a linear perspective. The drapery is attempting to be more realistic and does not fall on those really concentric rings and stylized folds. So that's going to lead us towards the Renaissance, and we still have some works that are considered to be Gothic that have a lot of more kind of almost overlapping qualities with the Renaissance. And this is going to happen beginning in Italy, as you know, in Italy they're surrounded by Greek and Roman artworks. This is Christ Entering Jerusalem by Duccio from 1308. And he was really influential in the shift to the Renaissance. He attempted to create believable outdoor space as well as kind of convey a sense of motion. And then the architecture here becomes really important in defining that space. So when we look at this, you can see the cityscape in the background. Then there's this diagonal movement in the image. You'll notice how some of the perspective seems a little bit off. So for example, we have this door where the vanishing point is over here, and then we have the archway where the vanishing point is over here. So it's not necessarily super convincing in terms of perspective, but there is an effort there to show three-dimensionality. We still have kind of a hierarchical scale. You can see Christ here is bigger than most other figures. Even the figures here, you know, the ones in the background appear to be somewhat bigger than some of the ones in the foreground. So that sense of hierarchy is not completely done away with, but the figures appear to be moving. They have more naturalism in terms of shading and in terms of the drapery that they're wearing. So moving us more towards the Renaissance. This is the Lamentations by Giotto from 1305 to 1306. And in this one, we really see some of those characteristics of the Renaissance that are starting to be used. So he's got original use of space here where we have, it's almost a theatrical space where all the figures are kind of pushed to the foreground. And then we have a background setting, like we have the mountain here and the tree. So it's almost like we're seeing actors on a stage. But then we have figures with their backs to us, which is a very important little detail, because if you think about the art of the Middle Ages, you'll notice how all the figures are always facing forward so that we can see them completely. So here, instead, we're seeing figures with their backs to us very much like we would if we were just walking by and we happened to look over and see this scene. We wouldn't see everyone staring out at us. There would be people with their backs to us as they're surrounding Christ after he's been crucified. So that sense of realism in terms of making it feel like a real scene is very important. You also have the figures showing emotion. So look at the faces here, wailing, crying. They're mourning the death of Christ. And so we're seeing a lot more emotion than we would have seen in the Middle Ages as well. The figures are round and full-bodied, so they're not flattened. There's more shading. The drapery is much more realistic. So they're really interacting in a more human way, and it's meant to be very much more realistic, as they're being influenced by those Greek and Roman statues that they are seeing again. So Gothic identifying characteristics include thinner walls than the Romanesque. You're going to see larger stained glass windows, pointed arches, repeated geometric units both horizontally and vertically on the interior and exterior of buildings. Sculpture is going to become increasingly realistic. So we're just moving towards the Renaissance at the end of the Gothic time period, and we're starting to see more realism. and things become much more like Greek and Roman art. So that's going to be the end of chapter 15, and I will see you next time.